My dad cut me off when I refused to carry on our family's medical legacy. I traded a guaranteed fortune of millions for a canvas of uncertainty. And in the silence that followed my father's final verdict, I realized that the price of my freedom was going to be paid in loneliness. My name is Evelyn, and I am 28 years old. For most of my life, I lived inside a gilded cage constructed of scalpels, stethoscopes, and the heavy, suffocating weight of expectation. I was born into a dynasty that didn't just practice medicine. They practically owned it in our state. My great-grandfather had founded the first hospital in the city. My grandfather had pioneered a surgical technique still taught in textbooks. And my father, the current patriarch, was a neurosurgeon whose name was spoken with reverent whispers in hospital hallways. To be born into this family was not a matter of choice. It was a matter of drafting. From the moment I could walk, I was groomed not just to follow, but to lead. Growing up, our home was less a residence and more of a sterile shrine to the sciences. The living room didn't smell of cookies or lavender. It smelled of antiseptic and old leather medical journals. While other children had posters of rock bands or movie stars on their walls, I had anatomical charts. Dinner conversations were never about how our day was emotionally. They were case studies. I learned about the intricacies of the human heart before I learned how to ride a bike. My father, a man of cold precision and terrifying discipline, looked at me not as a daughter, but as a vessel for his legacy. He saw the continuation of his own immortality in my hands. Hands he was determined to mold to hold a scalpel with the same steadiness as his own. But there was a secret I harbored, a burning, defiant fire that I kept hidden in the darkest corners of my closet, buried under piles of mandatory textbooks. While my father saw the mechanics of the body, I saw the art of the soul. I didn't want to cut people open to fix them. I wanted to paint the world as I saw it, full of chaos and color. I spent my high school years sneaking into the art room during lunch periods, my fingers stained with charcoal and oil paints, frantically trying to express the things I could never say aloud. Art was my rebellion, my silent scream against a future that had been written for me before I was even born. I knew that if he ever found out, the consequences would be catastrophic, but the need to create was stronger than the fear of him. The climax of my suppressed life occurred on a humid Tuesday night in August, right after my college graduation. I had spent the last 4 years navigating the brutal pre-med track my father had engineered, barely scraping by with a GPA that disappointed him, while secretly minoring in fine arts. The dinner table was set with the usual precision, the china white and glaring under the chandelier. My father sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, expecting the usual report on my upcoming medical school applications. The silence in the room was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I remember looking at my mother, a woman who had been eroded by years of submission to his will, seeing the silent plea in her eyes not to rock the boat. But I knew I couldn't go on. I couldn't spend the next 40 years pretending to be someone I wasn't, living a life that felt like a slow death. I put down my fork, the metal clinking against the plate sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. I told him that I wasn't going to medical school. I told him that I had been accepted into a prestigious conservatory for visual arts on a scholarship. I told him that I was done with the scalpels, the hospitals, and the legacy. The reaction wasn't explosive. It wasn't a shouting match or a thrown plate. It was far, far worse. It was a terrifying, absolute stillness. My father didn't move a muscle. He simply stared at me, his eyes devoid of any emotion, looking at me as if I were a failed experiment, a specimen that had gone horribly wrong. In that moment of silence, I realized that I wasn't his daughter anymore. I was a disappointment of such magnitude that it erased my existence in his eyes. He stood up slowly, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and placed it neatly beside his plate. He told me, in a voice as calm and flat as a monitor flatlining, that if I chose art over the family duty, then I would choose it without the family safety net. He explained that the resources, the trust fund, the connections, and the home were all tied to the continuation of the medical dynasty. By rejecting the path, I was rejecting the privilege that came with it. He didn't say it with anger. He said it with the cold, clinical detachment of a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb. He was cutting me off to save the system. And just like that, with a few calm sentences, the floor beneath me dissolved. I walked out of that house with nothing but a suitcase of clothes and a portfolio of paintings, stepping out of the light of wealth and into the cold, dark unknown of the real world. The first few weeks after my expulsion from the family estate were a blur of adrenaline and panic. I felt like I had been thrown into the ocean without a life vest, treading water in a vast, indifferent sea. The reality of my father's ultimatum hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had never paid a bill in my life. I didn't know how to lease an apartment, how to set up utilities, or how to buy groceries on a budget. The scholarship I had received for the art conservatory covered tuition, but it did nothing for the cost of living in the city. I found a tiny, cramped studio apartment in a neighborhood that was gentrifying but hadn't quite made it yet. The walls were thin, the plumbing rattled like a dying train, and the windows looked out onto a brick wall, but it was mine. It smelled of damp concrete and old pizza, a stark contrast to the sterile perfume of my childhood home. I spent the first night on a mattress on the floor, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, listening to the sirens wailing outside. The silence of the empty room was deafening, a stark reminder of the isolation I had chosen. My phone remained silent. No one from my world called. My mother didn't sneak a call to check on me. My father didn't text to see if I had caved. It was as if I had simply ceased to exist in their database. The erasure was total and absolute. I felt a hollowness in my chest that I tried to fill with cheap takeout and frantic sketching, but the grief was a persistent, aching throb. It wasn't just the loss of money or comfort. It was the loss of identity. For 22 years, I was a future doctor. Without that title, I didn't know who I was. I was just a girl with paint under her fingernails and a rapidly dwindling bank account. As the months dragged on, the adrenaline of rebellion faded, replaced by the grinding, monotonous reality of poverty. The art school was rigorous, demanding every ounce of my creative energy, but the physical demands of survival were draining me in a different way. I took a job as a barista at a gritty coffee shop near the train station, waking up at 4 a.m. to get there by opening time. My hands, which my father had so carefully groomed for precision, became rough and chapped from steaming milk and scrubbing counters. I smelled perpetually of roasted beans and bleach. I learned the delicate art of stretching a dollar until it screamed. I ate ramen noodles for weeks on end, skipped meals to pay for canvas, and wore my coats indoors because I couldn't afford to keep the heat above 60 degrees. The contrast between my old life and my new one was jarring, a constant slap in the face. I remember running into an old friend from high school, a girl who was now in her second year of medical school, just as my father had planned for me. She was dressed in designer scrubs, holding a cup of expensive coffee that cost as much as an hour of my wages. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion, unable to comprehend why I would throw away a life of guaranteed success for an apron and a cramped apartment. Her questions were innocent enough, but they felt like accusations. She asked if I regretted it. She asked if my father would ever take me back. I smiled a tight, painful smile and lied, telling her I was happier than I had ever been. But as I watched her walk away to her luxury car, the lie tasted like ash in my mouth. I wondered in the dark of the night if I had made a terrible mistake. There were moments, usually around the third of the month, when rent was due, when the temptation to crawl back was almost overwhelming. I imagined walking back into that pristine house, dropping to my knees and begging for forgiveness. I imagined trading my paintbrushes for a stethoscope just to feel warm again, just to feel safe. But then I would look at the half-finished canvas leaning against the peeling wallpaper of my apartment. I would see the colors that no one else could see, the vision that was mine and mine alone. I realized that the safety my father offered was a cage with golden bars, and while my freedom was cold and frightening, it was real. I was building something from nothing, brick by painful brick, and even though the structure was shaky, it was built on my own foundation. I was no longer a shadow of a great man. I was a terrified, struggling artist, and that was something. The second year of my exile brought a shift in my internal landscape. The acute panic of poverty began to dull into a chronic, low-grade ache that I learned to ignore. I had become proficient at the art of survival. I knew which grocery stores put out discounted meat at 8 p.m., and I knew how to fix a leaking faucet with duct tape and prayer. My art was evolving, fueled by the raw, unfiltered grit of my new surroundings. The glossy, academic portraits I painted in college were gone, replaced by textured, chaotic depictions of urban decay and human resilience. My professors praised the authenticity of my work, noting a new darkness in my color palette that seemed to vibrate with emotion. They didn't know that the darkness was just the reflection of my own exhaustion. However, the silence from my family remained a deafening void. I kept tabs on them through social media, a form of self-torture I couldn't quit. I saw my father accepting awards, his smile tight and professional. I saw my mother at charity galas, looking elegant and brittle. I saw my younger brother, who was now the golden child, being accepted into a pre-med program. It was like watching a movie of a life I had been edited out of. They were a perfectly functioning machine, moving forward without the cog I had been supposed to be. It stung to realize that the world kept turning, that the medical dynasty didn't crumble without me. I was irrelevant to their narrative. That realization was somehow more painful than the anger. It was the total absence of passion, the indifference that proved I had never been truly loved as an individual, only as an asset. During this time, I met a fellow artist named Julian at a dive bar we both frequented for the cheap wings. He was a sculptor who worked construction to pay the bills, a man with rough hands and a gentle spirit who saw the world in lines and angles. We connected over our shared struggle. The specific exhaustion of trying to create while the world demanded you survive. Julian became my anchor. He didn't come from money, so he didn't look at my background with pity or jealousy. He just saw me as Evelyn, the girl who painted like she was running out of time. He introduced me to a world of underground galleries and warehouse shows, a vibrant, messy community of people who were chasing their own versions of truth. Through Julian, I began to understand that my suffering wasn't unique. Everyone in our circle was fighting a battle against their own doubts, their own lack of support, their own fears of insignificance. My story of the rich girl who gave it all up became something of a legend among them, a cautionary tale or an inspiration depending on who you asked. But sharing the story with Julian helped me process the trauma. I realized that my father's rejection wasn't a judgment of my worth, but a limitation of his capacity. He was a man who only understood one kind of value, and I had simply opted out of his currency. Julian helped me see that my worth wasn't tied to a name or a bank account, but to the work I produced and the person I was becoming. But even with this newfound perspective, the shadow of my past loomed large. There were days when I stood in the art supply store, staring at a tube of cerulean blue paint that cost $40, unable to justify the expense because I needed to pay for electricity. The guilt was a heavy coat I couldn't take off. I thought about the trust fund sitting in a vault somewhere, accumulating interest, money that could solve all my problems in a second. I had to constantly remind myself why I left. I wasn't just fighting for art. I was fighting for the right to define my own existence. I was fighting the idea that my life was a resource to be managed by someone else. Every time I bought a tube of paint, instead of paying a bill on time, I was making a declaration of independence. It was a small, quiet war, but it was mine. By the third year, the narrative of my life began to shift from one of survival to one of tentative breakthrough. My body of work had accumulated enough weight and thematic consistency to attract the attention of a small, avant-garde gallery in the downtown district. The owner, a woman with sharp eyes and a nose for raw talent, offered me a slot in a group exhibition featuring emerging artists. The theme was origins, a concept that felt painfully ironic given my severed roots. I spent 6 months preparing for the show, pouring every ounce of my repressed history, my anger, and my grief into the canvases. I painted portraits of faceless surgeons, dissecting not bodies, but souls. I painted gold cages and open doors. I painted the silence of a dinner table where words were weapons. The opening night was a blur of cheap wine and nervous energy. I stood in the corner of the gallery, wearing a dress I had thrifted and altered myself, feeling like an imposter in a room full of pretension. But then, people started stopping in front of my paintings. Really stopping. I watched strangers stare at the chaotic layers of oil and charcoal, their brows furrowed, their eyes moving across the canvas as if they were reading a text I had written. I heard snippets of conversations, words like visceral, tragic, and haunting. For the first time, I wasn't the daughter of a famous surgeon. I wasn't the disappointment. I was a voice. I was an artist. The feeling was intoxicating, a rush far more potent than any social status I had ever known. Towards the end of the night, the gallery owner approached me with a serious expression. She introduced me to a collector who had been eyeing my largest piece, a triptych titled The Incision. The collector was an older man, quiet and unassuming. He didn't ask about my family or my credentials. He simply asked about the process. He asked about the meaning behind the red stroke that cut through the center of the canvas. When I explained the metaphor of the force cut, the division between duty and self, he nodded slowly. He bought the painting on the spot for a sum of money that made my knees weak. It wasn't millions, but it was enough to cover 6 months of rent and replace my broken easel. It was validation that came without conditions. That sale was the turning point, the crack in the dam. It wasn't just about the money. It was the first time the market had validated my choice. It proved that my obsession had tangible value in the real world. I walked home that night with a check in my purse and a lightness in my step that I hadn't felt in years. The city lights, usually just a backdrop to my exhaustion, seemed to shimmer with possibility. I allowed myself a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. I had done it. I had jumped without a net, and I hadn't hit the ground. I was flying, albeit low, to the ground and with shaky wings, but I was flying on my own power. However, success, even small success, brings its own kind of haunting. The morning after the sale, I woke up with an overwhelming urge to call my father. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to scream, "Look, I did something. I matter." It was a pathetic reflex, a lingering need for the approval of the ghost that haunted my childhood. I stared at his number on my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. I realized that even if I called, he wouldn't care. A sale in a small gallery meant nothing to a man who saved lives and built hospitals. His currency was power and prestige, not expression. With a trembling hand, I deleted the contact. It was a symbolic act, a second death of the relationship. I had to accept that my victory would never be celebrated in the house I grew up in. And that realization was the final step in truly leaving. 2 years later, I was 27, and my life had settled into a rhythm that was entirely my own. I was no longer working as a barista. I was teaching art classes at a community center and freelancing as an illustrator for local magazines. My work was gaining traction in the regional art scene. I had moved out of the studio apartment into a converted loft with high ceilings and northern light, a space that felt like a sanctuary rather than a cell. The constant gnawing hunger of poverty had receded, replaced by a comfortable, if modest, stability. I was surrounded by friends who knew me as an artist, not as a doctor's daughter. Julian and I had parted ways amicably, our paths diverging as his sculpture took him to the West Coast, but the lessons he taught me about self-worth remained. It was during this period of relative calm that the past decided to intrude. I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was simple: Evelyn. The body of the email was brief and cryptic. It was from a journalist writing a piece on prominent medical dynasties in the state. They wanted to interview me about the black sheep narrative. They had heard rumors about the estranged daughter who chose a bohemian life over the scalpel. They framed it as a human interest story, a sympathetic piece about finding one's own path. But I knew better. It was a tabloid grab. They wanted the drama of the disinheritance, the fall from grace. The mere existence of the email sent me spiraling. I had worked so hard to build a wall between my history and my present, and here was a stranger trying to poke holes in it. I felt exposed. I ignored the request, but the damage was done. The paranoia set in. I started looking over my shoulder, wondering if my father had put them up to it, or if he was somehow monitoring my success from afar. I became hyper-aware of my last name, a name I still carry professionally only because changing it felt like erasing the struggle that got me here. I felt like a fraud again, playing at being an artist while the world whispered about the surgeon's daughter. The stress began to manifest in my work. My canvases became tighter, the colors darker. I stopped painting for a few weeks, paralyzed by the fear that I was only interesting because of who I wasn't. I questioned my authenticity. Was my art actually good, or was people's fascination with it driven by the voyeuristic pleasure of watching a rich girl suffer? I felt the old, suffocating blanket of expectation lowering over me again, even though my father was miles away. I realized that the true legacy of my family wasn't medicine. It was control. And even without him in the room, I was still letting his judgment control me. I eventually responded to the journalist, but not with an interview. I wrote a scathing, polite letter declining the request, stating that my life was not a footnote to my father's career and that my work stood on its own merit. I demanded that they respect my privacy. To my surprise, they backed off. It was a confrontation I didn't want to have, but forced me to reclaim my narrative. I stood in my loft, looking at a blank canvas, and made a choice. I would paint the portrait of the journalist, faceless and distorted, representing the prying eyes of the world. It was the most therapeutic thing I could have done. I turned the intrusion into art, effectively digesting the trauma and turning it into fuel. The act of creation was my defense mechanism, my sword and shield against the ghosts of the medical dynasty. Time has a way of softening sharp edges, but it doesn't always heal the wound. It just teaches you how to live with the scar. By the time I turned 30, the anger had cooled into a distant, dull ache. I had achieved a level of recognition in the art world that I used to dream about during those cold nights in the studio apartment. I had a solo show scheduled in a reputable gallery in the city, one that my parents might actually see if they bothered to look at the cultural section of a newspaper. The irony of the venue wasn't lost on me. It was in the same district as the hospital where my father conducted his life's work. In the weeks leading up to the show, I found myself thinking about him more often. I wondered if he was aging, if his hands were still steady, if he ever thought of me in the quiet moments between surgeries. I had a brother now who was a full-fledged doctor, carrying the torch that I had dropped. I hoped he was happier with it than I would have been. I hoped the weight of the legacy didn't crush him the way it had threatened to crush me. I realized that I didn't hate my father anymore. Pity, perhaps. Pity for a man so trapped in his own rigidity that he couldn't see the value in his own child unless she mirrored him perfectly. He was a tragic figure in his own right, a king of a small, sterile kingdom. The night of the solo show was the busiest of my life. The gallery was packed with collectors, critics, and friends. There was a buzz in the air, a tangible energy that I had only ever felt in the ER of the hospital during my father's visits, though this energy was creative rather than clinical. I moved through the crowd, a glass of champagne in hand, answering questions about technique and inspiration. I felt a sense of grounding, a certainty that this was exactly where I was meant to be. I was no longer the girl who ran away. I was the woman who arrived. Towards the middle of the evening, the crowd near the entrance parted, and a figure walked in that made my heart stop. It wasn't my father. It was my mother. She looked older than I remembered, her hair grayer, her face more lined. She was dressed in a way that was conservative but understated, trying perhaps not to draw attention to herself. She stood by the door, clutching her purse, looking around the room with wide, overwhelmed eyes. Our gazes met across the room, and for a moment, the noise of the gallery faded away. I felt the urge to run to her, to hug her, to cry into her shoulder. But I also felt the urge to run away, to protect the fragile world I had built. I walked toward her slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I reached her, she didn't say anything. She just looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. She reached out and touched my arm, a gesture so tentative it broke my heart. She whispered that she had seen the announcement in the paper and that she just wanted to see. She didn't mention my father. She didn't apologize. She just stood there, a bridge between the two worlds that I had spent a decade trying to separate. I realized then that she was a prisoner too, just as I had been, but she had never found the strength to leave the cage. Seeing her there, surrounded by my art, was the closure I never knew I needed. I gave her a tour of the show, explaining the paintings in a voice that shook only slightly. She listened intently, nodding, seeing a side of me she had never been allowed to acknowledge. When she left an hour later, she hugged me, and in that embrace, I felt the forgiveness I hadn't been able to give myself. It has been 3 years since my mother visited my show, and 6 years since I walked out of my father's house for the last time. I am now a woman with a history that is completely my own. The gallery shows have continued, and I'm currently working on a series inspired by the concept of healing. Not through cutting, as my father would have it, but through reconstruction. Through acknowledging the broken parts of ourselves and piecing them back together into something beautiful. I am financially stable, surrounded by a community that loves me for who I am. And most importantly, I wake up every morning excited to face the day. I never reconciled with my father. He passed away quietly last winter, a complication of a surgery he was too stubborn to let anyone else perform. My mother called to tell me, her voice sounding small and far away. She told me he was proud of the obituary they wrote in a medical journal, listing his achievements, his successors. She didn't say if he mentioned me. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't need to stand in a room full of doctors and mourn a man who died years ago, the day he disinherited his daughter. Instead, I went to my studio and painted. I painted a portrait of an old man, alone in a sterile room, looking at a painting he couldn't understand. It was an act of forgiveness, not for him, but for me. I forgave him for being unable to love me the way I needed. The inheritance, as it turned out, was a moot point. My father's estate, vast and impressive, was largely tied up in the hospital foundation and trust fund for the medical education of his descendants. Since I was not a doctor, and since I had been legally cut off, there was nothing for me. And that is exactly how I wanted it. I bought my freedom with my own sweat and sacrifice, and that makes every ounce of it sweeter. I look at the life I have now, the paint under my nails, the smell of turpentine in the air, the silence of the studio at midnight, and I know that I made the right choice. The medical dynasty continues without me. My brother is the head of neurosurgery now. I wish him well. I hope he finds joy in the work, a joy I never could. But my legacy is different. My legacy is on the canvases that hang in homes across the country, in the students I teach who are afraid to follow their dreams, and in the story of a girl who chose to be poor rather than be false. I look in the mirror and I see Evelyn, the artist. I see a woman who survived the expectations of a giant and carved out a space for herself in the world. I see someone who knows that the truest form of healing isn't about fixing what is broken on the outside, but about nurturing the wild, untamed spirit on the inside. I cut the cord, and in doing so, I finally found my pulse.